A few years ago, I was having dinner with a close family friend, a baby boomer, and the conversation turned to the future. This man, a self-made success who'd spent his life accumulating real estate and a solid stock portfolio, was discussing his will. He was very clear about his plans. Every asset was meticulously itemized, every penny destined for his 3 children. "I'm leaving them a legacy," he said, puffing his chest out a bit. "They're set up for life." He genuinely believed he was ensuring his kids and grandkids would never have to worry. But then he paused, took a long sip of wine, and a completely different look came over his face. He lowered his voice, almost as if sharing a secret. "You know," he admitted, "I'm probably going to have to sell the beach house next year." When I asked why, he didn't mention market conditions or a desire for simplification. Instead, he started listing his healthcare costs, the astronomical price of his wife's specialized care, the annual cost of his own prescriptions, the looming specter of long-term care insurance. He confessed that, between the fear of outliving his savings and the reality of his bills, the legacy he had so proudly planned was shrinking every single month. That pristine $5 million estate he'd worked for was quietly being drained by a financial force he couldn't control: the sheer cost of being old. This moment was a perfect, heartbreaking snapshot of the largest wealth transfer in human history, an estimated $124 trillion shifting from boomers to their heirs by 2048. The headline number is staggering, and it's what everyone focuses on. But what my friend's honesty revealed is the brutal caveat. A significant portion of that inheritance will never actually be inherited. It will be absorbed by healthcare, inflation, and a generation simply deciding to spend their way to a comfortable end. The true story of the $124 trillion inheritance is not just about the money being transferred, but the intense, quiet battle being waged right now to keep it.
And that really is the perfect entry point for today's deep dive. We're talking about something unprecedented in economic history.
It's the sheer scale of it. It's hard to wrap your head around.
It is. This is the largest, the fastest redistribution of private wealth we've ever seen. It's colossal. It's a one-time event, and it's going to reshape, everything. Global economies, how we invest, public policy, and yes, your own family's financial future for the next couple of decades.
Right. So our mission today is to get past that eye-popping number, the $124 trillion, and really dig into the structural pressures this is creating.
Exactly. We need to look at the consequences.
Yeah.
So we're going to focus on 3 critical areas where this private wealth transfer creates some serious public and philosophical friction.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, we'll get into how this massive concentration of wealth structurally challenges the whole idea of meritocracy, the American dream, if you will.
The idea that you can make it on your own effort.
Precisely. Then we need to analyze the clash of values that's happening right now in the marketplace. I'm talking about ESG, values-based investing, and the huge anti-woke backlash that's come with it.
And finally,
we have to look at the really personal side of this, the often devastating breakdown of family relationships that happens when you put this much stress, this much legal weight on a family during the inheritance process. This whole deep dive is about the systemic changes and the hidden costs of trying to make prosperity last forever.
Okay, let's start with grounding ourselves in the scale, because even saying the number doesn't quite do it justice. We're talking about $124 trillion in assets.
124 trillion.
Primarily moving from the baby boomers and the silent generation to Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, all by 2048.
And if you try to put that number in perspective, you're talking about a significant fraction of total global GDP. It's not just money changing hands. It's a complete reorganization of economic power.
It feels like more than just a big number, though. It feels like a perfect financial storm. What created this?
It is a perfect storm. It's a phenomenal convergence of a few key factors that make this shift totally unique. I'd say there are 3 primary drivers that got us here.
So what's driver number 1, the biggest one?
It's simply the demographics. The sheer size of the baby boomer cohort all hitting peak age at roughly the same time. The retirement wave.
So it's a volume game.
It's a volume game in people and in the wealth they control. Let's just look at the U.S. for a second. In 2021, households aged 55 and older held a staggering 71% of all bequeathable wealth.
71%. That's almost 3/4 of everything.
Everything. We're not just talking about their 401ks. This is real estate, stocks, small businesses, you name it. That massive concentration of capital in just 2 aging generations is the source, the wellspring for this whole transfer.
That number really gives you a sense of the economic leverage, the market power that's been sitting with boomers for the last few decades.
Absolutely. Which leads right into the second factor. They had decades of almost uninterrupted accumulation. This is the generation that entered the workforce during that huge post-World War II economic boom.
A completely different economic reality than today?
A different universe. They saw massive asset appreciation. They benefited from decades of bull markets, not just in stocks, but critically in housing. They had half a century of time, low early costs, and leverage working relentlessly in their favor.
And then there's the third factor, which you hit on in the opening story, longevity. People are just living longer.
That's right, and that has a huge effect. Longer lives mean the distribution of wealth is delayed. In your grandparents' generation, wealth might have been transferred earlier in smaller chunks.
Right, maybe a house here, some savings there.
Exactly. But today, that wealth is being held onto, it's appreciating, it's compounding for a much longer period. And the result is you get a single massive shift happening all at once, much later in life. This concentration via longevity just amplifies that $124 trillion headline figure even more.
Okay, that sets the enormous scale. But now we have to get to the brutal caveats, the reality check you mentioned. The fact that a lot less wealth is actually going to be inherited than that figure suggests.
Right.
So what are the specific forces draining this massive pool of money right now?
The single biggest one, and it connects directly back to your friend's story, is the healthcare drain. We all celebrate living longer, but we don't often talk about the astronomical medical costs that come with it, especially in the U.S.
It's the elephant in the room for any retirement plan.
A massive elephant. If you look at the projections, a 65-year-old in the U.S. can expect to spend over $165,000 on healthcare throughout retirement. And that's just the baseline.
And that number has to be conservative, right? Especially for high net worth individuals who are probably seeking out more specialized or experimental care. They're going to spend more.
Precisely. And that number, that $165,000, that doesn't even account for long-term care. That is the true destroyer of estates.
So nursing home costs.
Yes. Nursing home costs, even for just moderate level care, often top $64,000 a year per person. So if you have a high net worth individual who needs, say, 5 or 6 years of specialized memory care, which isn't at all uncommon with diseases like Alzheimer's.
You could wipe out a multi-million-dollar estate in under a decade.
Easily. The sheer cost of advanced age and chronic illness is the primary funnel just sucking away the legacy.
So on one side, the money is being spent defensively just to maintain health and a certain quality of life. But then there's a voluntary element too, isn't there? The boomer spend down.
Yes, and this is a really distinct psychological and cultural shift. The die with zero idea, or at least a very strong focus on maximizing your own security, has really taken root.
It's no longer about scrimping and saving for the kids.
The data is pretty clear on this. Our sources show that only about 11% of boomers say that leaving an inheritance is their top financial goal.
Only 11%.
Wow. Their priority is their own comfort, dealing with inflation,
Right.
and just getting rid of that fear of outliving their savings. So this focus on their own financial security actively drives them to consume their assets. They are consciously drawing down what might have been transferred.
Which means the inheritance is shrinking by necessity.
Yeah.
Because of healthcare, and by design because of a generational choice. Okay, so now let's talk about the money that does make it through, because even that shrinking pool is not exactly being spread around evenly.
This is maybe the most critical point for understanding the societal consequences. This transfer is extremely, extremely concentrated. While $124 trillion is the total estimated number, over half of that, an estimated $62 trillion, is expected to come from just the top 2% of households.
The top 2%.
Yes.
That's where this gets really interesting and, frankly, a little scary. When you have $62 trillion moving through the hands of the people who are already rich, it's not just a transfer of wealth. It's a force that is going to massively exacerbate the wealth and income inequality we already have.
It's a powerful mechanism for just baking in that inequality for another generation at least. If you look at income inequality metrics anywhere in the world, this massive transfer of passive unearned wealth, it just overwhelms any gains in social mobility that the middle and lower classes might have achieved through their earned income.
And you can see this structural reinforcement really clearly when you look at something like the persistent racial wealth gap in the U.S.
Absolutely. The historical and structural factors, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, they created these enormous disparities in the opportunity to accumulate wealth between white households and Black and Hispanic households over the last century. That's just a historical fact.
And this transfer reflects that history.
It magnifies it. Because the overall transfer is so heavily concentrated in the wealthiest households, who are disproportionately white, the transfer itself reinforces those existing economic divisions instead of narrowing them. Black and Hispanic households tend to receive inheritances at lower rates and of smaller sizes, and their wealth is often held in less easily transferable forms, like lower rates of home or business ownership. So the great wealth transfer becomes, just by its very nature, a mechanism for the unequal distribution of past systemic advantage.
This extreme concentration, this funneling of massive wealth into the hands of a tiny percentage of heirs leads us straight to the first major structural impact we need to talk about, the challenge to the whole ideal of meritocracy.
It really does.
It just begs the question, how much individual effort can possibly compete with a $62 trillion head start?
That is the profound philosophical dilemma facing Western liberal democracies today. This transfer is throwing the tension between individual effort and inherited status into really sharp relief.
There's an anecdote I came across that just illustrates this perfectly. It's the story of the Cheng family. The patriarch, Michael, was a silent generation engineer who, hit the jackpot in the early days of Silicon Valley.
Right place, right time.
Exactly. He ends up with a $50 million fortune. When he passes away, the estate is split between his kids. David, a Gen X son, who's a mid-level manager in a respectable but kind of stagnant industry, and Sarah, a millennial consultant who's working really hard to build her own practice.
And you have to think about David. This is a guy who probably spent his whole life believing in the purity of hard work. He went to college, paid his dues, worked 40 hours a week for 20 years.
He did everything he was supposed to do.
Everything. And yet, in a single day, he gets this passive windfall from his father's good timing and, systemic advantages, the bull market, the housing boom, that completely dwarfs his entire lifetime of earned income.
It almost makes a mockery of the idea that your outcome in life reflects your individual effort and talent, which is, the foundational promise of meritocracy.
It does. The classical liberal ideal of social mobility suggests that you rise or fall based on your abilities and how hard you work. But when over half of this colossal transfer is concentrated in the top 2%, the sheer gravitational pull of that past wealth accumulation just overwhelms any notion of individual achievement in the present.
And the playing field isn't just tilted, it's a different game entirely.
Exactly. The economic playing field is being leveled, but only for those who are already at the very top. For the vast majority of people, the defining economic factor in their life isn't where they start, but where their parents finished.
So that initial starting position, the inherited wealth, it just warps the whole concept of fair competition. But here's the question. If people believe in meritocracy, why don't we see a bigger push for redistribution, for things like high inheritance taxes to level that playing field? Is there something psychological going on that makes us accept this, even when it's clearly unearned by the person receiving it?
That is the absolute crux of the problem. And behavioral economics gives a really fascinating answer. There have been these psychological studies using what's called the impartial spectator model, and they're designed to test this exact thing. The dilemma of meritocracy.
Okay, so it's a simulation.
It's a simulation that tries to get at what happens when inequality is inherited.
Walk us through the setup. What did these researchers actually do?
The setup is actually quite elegant. Subjects, who are acting as these impartial spectators, are asked to redistribute money between a couple of passive recipients. Now, the crucial part is that the money disparity isn't created by what the recipients did. It's created by the actions of other people active participants, who are often described as the recipient's friends or family.
So the people getting the money are just sitting there. Their friends are the ones generating the wealth.
Exactly. And the wealth is generated in two very distinct ways for those active participants. Either through pure luck, like a random dice roll, for example, or through intense, measurable effort, like completing some tedious, really difficult task. This simulates inherited inequality. Did the wealth come from passive luck or from active effort in the previous generation?
So you're basically asking the spectator to decide what's fair when one person gets a huge benefit because their friend was lucky versus when they get it because their friend worked their tail off.
Precisely. And the core finding reveals this massive cognitive asymmetry in how people process inequality. When the inequality was based on luck, the spectators showed a strong, almost overwhelming preference for equality. They generally equalized by 80% of the inequality.
80%. That's a huge push towards equality. It shows that people really recognize and reject arbitrary inequality that's just caused by pure chance.
It's a very clear moral statement against passive luck, creating these massive disparities. But, and this is the important part, the result flipped dramatically when the inequality was generated by effort.
How much did it flip?
When the money was earned through the hard work of the previous generation, the active participant spectators only equalized between 5% and 8%.
Wait, from 80% down to 5%? That 70+ percentage point difference between luck and effort is just astonishing.
It is.
It means people are highly, highly reluctant to interfere with wealth that has the stamp of effort on it, even if the person receiving it right now did absolutely nothing to earn it.
That is the meritocracy dilemma in action. For people who champion meritocracy, inherited inequality that was generated by effort creates this fundamental ethical conflict. They're stuck between two competing ideas of fairness.
What are the two ideas?
On one hand, you have fairness to the active earner, the parent who worked hard to earn that $50 million estate. On the other hand, you have fairness to the passive recipient, the child who gets this unearned windfall, and by extension, fairness to everyone else who starts at zero.
And the experimental results seem to suggest that people overwhelmingly resolve this dilemma in favor of the generating party's historical effort. They prioritize the parent's work over the child's current reality.
Correct. They view the parent's effort as the originating, legitimizing factor. And the profound conclusion here is that this perception helps explain why we see such widespread opposition to policies like high inheritance taxes or wealth redistribution. Many people seem to believe that these unequal starting positions aren't actually arbitrary, but that they ultimately result from different effort levels within earlier generations.
So in their minds, they're essentially saying, my grandfather earns this through his sweat and toil, and that makes it morally acceptable for me to start way ahead of you, even if I personally haven't earned it yet.
That's the tension exactly. They justify the inherited inequality by locating the meritocracy in the past, not in the present. They find themselves stuck between accepting unequal opportunities for the current generation or being unfair to the past generation's effort. And they consistently choose the former as the lesser evil. They prioritize the deceased's right to the fruits of their labor.
So the societal effect of this $124 trillion transfer isn't just financial, it's philosophical. It's creating a deeper psychological normalization of inherited privilege that's rooted in this idea of historical merit.
That's a great way to put it.
So if society is prioritizing the effort of the parent over the reality of the child, what are those children, now flush with all this passive wealth, choosing to do with it? The next logical question has to be, what happens when this enormous effort-justified capital meets the values of the inheriting generations?
And that transition is absolutely key, because this great wealth transfer is not just a financial transaction, it's a massive transfer of investment power. And with that power comes a really dramatic shift in priorities, especially when you look at the demographics of the new wealth holders.
We're seeing this monumental generational power shift. Gen X is moving into control, millennials and Gen Z are becoming a dominant cohort. But we should also be clear about the profound gender power shift that's happening at the same time.
Yes, the rise of women as wealth holders is a massive and I think often underreported component of this whole thing. Baby boomer women alone are expected to inherit nearly $40 trillion.
$40 trillion.
Often as widows who are now managing the family fortune for the very first time. So this surge in female wealth ownership, combined with the preferences of younger generations, is dramatically reshaping investment priorities.
We know younger generations are more inclined toward technology, right? Higher ownership of cryptocurrency, AI stocks, that sort of thing. But the real structural change is the values focus. For this new guard, money seems to come with a conscience, and that's driving the shift toward ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing.
This is where private capital meets public values, and the friction is intense.
Let's use that anecdote of Chloe to frame this. She's a zillennial, and she inherits a controlling stake in a mid-sized, very traditional textile manufacturing company from her silent generation grandmother.
And she's not content to just let things run as they are.
Not at all. Chloe immediately demands a radical shift. She wants to source only ethically certified organic cotton. She's insisting on carbon neutral shipping, and she wants to divest from any supplier that doesn't have strong labor transparency. This push for strict ESG compliance, of course, cuts significantly into their short-term profit margins.
And predictably, the long-standing older management team just pushes back fiercely. They see Chloe's demands as woke culture run amok. They're arguing that these decisions prioritize subjective social goals over their fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value.
This friction is the perfect encapsulation of the intellectual conflict, all seen against the backdrop of classical liberalism. The traditional corporate view, the one famously championed by economist Milton Friedman, holds that a business's only social responsibility is to increase its profits as long as it stays within the rules of the game.
And Chloe's demands directly challenge that profit-first maxim. She's basically arguing that the social and environmental license to operate is the long-term economic rule of the game now. And the backlash against this intrusion of values into economics, is now a defining feature of the financial landscape.
What's so fascinating, though, is the apparent contradiction in how the anti-ESG movement, which claims to be championing pure free market principles, operates politically.
The contradiction is striking. I mean, just consider the legislative response we're seeing. You have states, like Texas, enacting laws that prohibit state government entities from contracting with businesses that boycott energy companies or firearms manufacturers.
Hang on a minute. If I'm the treasurer of a state pension fund, shouldn't my fiduciary duty just be to get the best return? Shouldn't that allow me the freedom to choose whichever financial services firm I want, regardless of their own investment philosophies?
One would think.
Isn't that the very definition of a free market? The ability of a free agent to transact with whomever they choose.
That's the core of the challenge. Critics argue that these anti-ESG laws are completely antithetical to pure free market principles because they dictate who a free agent, the state in this case, can choose to do business with. It's politics overriding economic choice, all in the name of protecting specific industries, and it's wrapped in the language of economic freedom.
And yet, Friedman himself offered a subtle caveat to his own maxim. He did concede that corporations can, and maybe even should, take actions, even those perceived as woke, if they can be justified as being in the company's long-term self-interest.
The long-term view is everything. Actions like Google building housing for its employees, or a textile company like Chloe's adopting green policies, can be strategically defended. You can argue it's managing reputational risk, or improving employee morale, or attracting top talent, which are all financial concerns over a reasonable timeline.
So when consumers vote with their feet, for example, by rewarding a company for being environmentally conscious, that's just the free market registering a new kind of value preference.
Exactly. The complexity comes in when politicians and regulators try to unilaterally define what that long-term self-interest must be.
Which leads us right into the rapidly escalating legal and corporate backlash we're seeing play out in the U.S. right now.
It's a profound shift. Let's just quantify that backlash for a moment, because it is rapidly changing corporate behavior. As of late 2023, 20 U.S. states have enacted anti-ESG laws.
20 states.
And beyond the state capitals, Congress has launched inquiries questioning financial firms over alleged coordination on ESG issues, raising antitrust concerns. The political fight has really crystallized into tangible legislative efforts that are intended to create corporate liability for decisions that are deemed too woke.
We're talking about legislation like Senator Rubio's Mind Your Own Business Act, right? Which tries to put the burden of proof on the company, essentially challenging the fundamental legal structure that protects management decisions.
Exactly. This proposed law attempts to create a cause of action where shareholders can actually sue if a company's woke actions, say Chloe's shift to organic cotton, cannot be proven to be in the shareholders' pecuniary interest. This is in fundamental conflict with the business judgment rule.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you define the business judgment rule for us?
Sure. The business judgment rule is a decades-old legal doctrine, and it's designed to protect corporate directors and officers. It basically presumes that directors act on an informed basis, in good faith, and in the honest belief that what they're doing is in the corporation's best interests. This rule effectively shields management from shareholder lawsuits over decisions that just turn out to be bad business, as long as they weren't, illegal or fraudulent.
So this proposed anti-ESG law is trying to overturn decades of legal precedent. Instead of protecting management unless they act illegally, it forces them to prove their social policies will generate immediate cash.
That is precisely the shift. And the law attempts to narrow the definition of pecuniary interest dramatically. It explicitly states that actions intended to improve employee morale or reputation or the cost of capital are not automatically considered pecuniary interests.
But any corporate counsel would argue that those factors, reputation, talent acquisition, brand loyalty, are absolutely pecuniary interests over a reasonable investment horizon of 10, 20, or 30 years. You can't separate your long-term financial health from your environmental or social impact.
It creates an enormous legal and operational distraction. If management has to fear personal liability every single time they make a decision about climate policy or DEI, they will inevitably just retreat to only the safest, most immediate profit-maximizing actions. And that is exactly what we have seen.
You're talking about the very palpable retreat in the U.S. financial world.
Yes. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, he publicly stated he would no longer use the term ESG because it has become weaponized politically. Yeah. S&P Global, a major arbiter of corporate finance, dropped ESG from its credit ratings entirely.
And it's not just them.
Not at all. Major financial institutions, BlackRock, JP Chase, Wells Fargo, they've all withdrawn from key climate initiatives. Some groups, like the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, have had to suspend their operations in the U.S. just because of the political pressure.
And this retreat extends to the corporate side, too, especially around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI.
Absolutely. Driven by shareholder lawsuits and this political pressure, firms like Meta, Target, McDonald's, they have canceled or significantly scaled back their DEI commitments. They're eliminating specific representation goals, getting rid of diversity pledges, or even dismantling entire internal DEI training and resource groups. The backlash is undeniable, and it's fueled by the mixed empirical evidence that links general ESG compliance to superior short-term financial performance.
This complexity suggests that the term ESG is just too broad. It seems like not all values-based investments are created equal. We need some kind of framework to distinguish between what is actually valuable to the business and what is just posturing, a checklist approach.
We do. And the resource-based view, or RBV, of the firm provides that framework. RVV analyzes value creation by classifying ESG strategies based on their potential to create a sustained competitive advantage. We can basically categorize the whole spectrum of ESG strategies into 4 distinct groups.
Okay, let's walk through the 3 that tend to fail or backfire first.
The first and most obvious one is greenwashing. This is just the exaggeration of commitment or inflating your progress to distract from core corporate failings.
Like H&M promoting sustainability while still operating on a fast fashion model.
Exactly. Or firms with high ESG scores that are found to be violating core labor laws. This just introduces noise, it reduces accountability, and ultimately it invites regulatory scrutiny. It's a strategy that relies on deception, and eventually it fails.
Okay, what's the second one?
The second is what's called borrowed virtue. This is when top management uses shareholder money to promote their own personal, political, or social values.
Usually to gain prestige, right? Get invited to Davos, feel good about themselves.
That's it. The virtue is borrowed because the shareholders are the ones footing the bill. A really high-profile example would be Disney's intense political entanglement in Florida. While it may have boosted internal morale among certain employees, it risked alienating a huge segment of their customers and investors by embroiling the company in financial conflicts that had no direct connection to their core business strategy.
So the management is acting as an agent for their own values instead of the shareholders' pecuniary interest. And the third type is the one we see everywhere, bureaucratic ESG.
This is pure box checking. The firm minimizes its reporting costs just to gain access to capital or meet a required regulatory disclosure or just tick a box for institutional investors. They recast what they're already doing as ESG advancing without making any material changes to their operations.
Like that Business Roundtable statement in 2019 where all those CEOs pledged commitment to all stakeholders.
A perfect example. Many of the signatory firms later indicated in their corporate documents that this commitment required no material change in their governance practices. So, greenwashing, borrowed virtue, and bureaucratic ESG. They don't generate sustained competitive advantage, and they are the primary source of the political and investor backlash.
Which leaves us with the only type of values-based strategy that can actually work over the long term, strategic ESG.
Strategic ESG is the only approach that has the potential for sustained superior performance. But it demands meaningful investments that leverage resources that are valuable, rare, imperfectly imitable, and non-substitutable.
So if an ESG initiative can be easily copied by competitors, like, say, adding simple demographic diversity to a board or donating a fixed percentage of profit to charity, the firm can't actually appropriate the value it creates.
Exactly. There's no competitive advantage.
Can you give us a concrete example of an imperfectly imitable ESG asset? What does that actually look like?
Sure. Consider a firm that commits to completely overhauling its supply chain to achieve proprietary, verifiable, end-to-end carbon neutrality. And they do it using patented technology that they developed internally.
So the tech itself is the rare asset.
The proprietary technology is rare and non-substitutable. Or think about this. The decade-long dedication it would take to build a deep, trusting relationship with local communities around a production facility, creating a unique social license to operate that's socially complex and extremely difficult for competitors to just imitate quickly. That is strategic ESG.
But if a company just adopts standard industry-wide board diversity metrics,
It doesn't gain an advantage because every single one of its competitors can easily do the exact same thing.
I see. So strategic ESG must not pursue a non-pecuniary interest as an end in itself, but as a means to a financial end. The distinction is about genuine value creation versus simple compliance, and that distinction is the key to surviving the political backlash this $124 trillion transfer has unleashed. We've established that the $124 trillion transfer structurally challenges meritocracy and fundamentally alters how capital gets allocated. Now, let's pivot to the most personal impact. What this wealth transfer does to the family unit itself. The family is the intended recipient, the bedrock of the legacy, but the reality is that the transfer process often becomes a destructive, bitter battleground.
That's the heartbreaking truth of it. When you introduce these massive sums of private wealth, especially at a moment of profound grief and loss, the family setting becomes uniquely vulnerable to conflict. It's a psychological and legal pressure cooker.
I'm thinking of that common scenario of sibling disputes over inherited real estate and ambiguous wills. Like the story of the brother and sister in the wealthy London suburbs. They inherited these prime assets, but their mother had made conflicting verbal promises to them over the years, and the formal will was just vague enough to trigger an immediate legal challenge.
And that kind of dispute is so common because typically the brother wanted a fast sale to maximize his liquid capital, while the sister wanted to keep the specific property for sentimental reasons, using some complicated trust structure.
And the result was not just a legal battle, it was the total breakdown of their adult relationship. They stopped speaking, which demonstrates that the dispute is never, ever purely financial.
It's intensely emotional. The will is not just a document that distributes assets.
What is it then?
It's a unique and final form of communication between the dead and the living. It signals more than just what the deceased valued financially. The distributional scheme indicates who is valued. For children, the will, especially if it's unequal, is often interpreted as the parent's final, concrete statement about who is successful or who is responsible or ultimately who is loved. It feels a lot like love to the people receiving it.
So when that distribution is unequal or even just perceived as unequal, it's not just a financial loss for one of them. It's a profound emotional injury that just reactivates all this latent sibling rivalry and old grievances.
It absolutely reactivates those old patterns. Parental death is already such an emotionally vulnerable time, and any clear or perceived favoritism that's expressed in the will just triggers years of stored rivalry. And this emotional vulnerability is exactly why wills that exclude immediate family or show clear preference are highly susceptible to legal challenge. Legal practitioners view these as huge judicial red flags.
Because they violate established social norms about how a family's wealth should be distributed.
Correct. Courts are often guided by these social norms. They tend to uphold testamentary plans that conform to our general expectations. If a will seems unnatural, excluding a needy child, favoring a new partner over children from a long marriage, or just a grossly unequal distribution, judges are much more likely to find grounds to defeat that will based on technicalities like undue influence or a lack of mental capacity.
And it goes even further in some places, doesn't it?
It does. In jurisdictions like the UK, you have laws like the Inheritance Act of 1975, which allows adult children, even those who are financially independent, to challenge a perfectly valid will on the basis that they were not made reasonable financial provision.
That seems like an enormous intrusion of the state into private family matters. You're forcing judges to effectively resolve these deeply personal, emotional issues about fairness and affection.
And it raises a critical point about the erosion of family authority and, really, testamentary freedom. These laws, by allowing adult children to challenge wills, they undermine the will maker's final authority, what some legal scholars call the right to spite. It reflects a societal shift where the individual's claim is prioritized over the family unit.
This hyper-individualistic conflict fighting kin over wealth, it really validates that worry that money is acting as a solvent for the very foundations of social cohesion. The family, which is supposed to be the bedrock of stability, just fractures under the weight of the asset, and individuals guard their claims jealously, even against their own siblings.
And that fracturing leads us to the final and larger economic theme here, the societal trend towards controlling assets far, far beyond death, what we can call the privatization of immortality.
Historically, societies have wrestled with how far the dead hand of the past should be allowed to control the living. They often place limits on how long wealth could be tied up.
Exactly. The initial liberal movements really sought to restrain that kind of control. But starting around the 1970s, conservative and neoliberal policies began systematically reversing those historical measures that were aimed at preventing the sustained control of private assets across generations.
And the legal mechanism for this reversal is the repeal of the Rule Against Perpetuities, or RAPs. We should probably define RAPs clearly for our listeners, because this is a highly technical but profoundly impactful legal concept.
The Rule Against Perpetuities was a common law legal principle, and it was designed to stop assets from being controlled forever. It essentially ensured that property had to return to the open market and be freely alienable, able to be bought or sold within a defined time limit. Usually it was pegged to a life in being plus 21 years, which generally meant property had to be released within about 100 years.
So it's a legal mechanism to ensure dynamic capitalism and social mobility, to prevent powerful families from creating these generational wealth dynasties that perpetually controlled assets.
It was essential for a functioning fluid economy. But today, the steady repeal or radical extension of RAPs in some U.S. states like Delaware, South Dakota, Nevada, it allows for the ownership and use of property to be stipulated in trusts for up to 1,000 years into the future.
1,000 years. A millennium of control exerted by the dead hand. That is just a staggering visualization of private wealth seeking absolute permanence. How does a 1,000-year trust in Delaware affect things like property taxes or zoning in the heir's hometown today?
It creates enormous rigidity and insulation. The wealth is tied up in these structures, family offices, dynasty trusts, that are deliberately designed to be impervious to taxation, to creditors, and even to the current beneficiaries on poor judgment. This insulation from the common world allows for sustained private power to dictate terms in the present.
How so?
Well, if assets are locked into a trust for 500 years, local governments lose the ability to easily tax or regulate that capital because the structure is designed to preserve power rather than contribute to the dynamism of the local economy.
This defensive wealth management, this rise of trusts and family offices, it's all dedicated to preserving wealth from creditors and even from the heir's own mismanagement. It reflects the original owner's refusal to ever relinquish control. Some critics have called this a form of neo-feudalism.
That term is used very specifically. It's because these structures seek to ensure that political and economic power is inherited and sustained across centuries, creating a class of property owners who are structurally immune to the normal churn and risk of the market. This massive $124 trillion transfer is just fuel for an entire industry that's dedicated to making sure that wealth outlives the owner, often by centuries, and is insulated from any public oversight.
Which brings us back to the core existential problem. If the family unit itself is fracturing, and the ability to control assets across a millennium is now enshrined in law, what does that say about our collective future?
It reflects a deep fear that the common world is endangered, ecologically, politically, socially, which leads individuals to turn increasingly to private property and assets as their source of existential security. They are substituting the conservation of public things and a shared communal future with the aggressive defense of private property. They're seeking a link to the afterlife through their wealth, ensuring their personal legacy remains, even if the world around them becomes unsustainable.
That's a powerful summation. We started with the sheer size of the $124 trillion transfer.
Yeah.
And we've ended up analyzing how it fundamentally challenges our foundational beliefs about society, economics, and even family cohesion.
It touches everything.
Let's just summarize the three major structural impacts we've unpacked in this deep dive.
First, the system is being fundamentally reorganized around inherited status rather than pure individual achievement. The weight of past accumulation is just overwhelming meritocracy.
And that trend is reinforced by our psychological tendency to validate these unequal starting positions, as long as they resulted from a prior generation's documented effort and not from arbitrary luck.
Exactly. Second, the allocation of capital is no longer a purely economic function. It has become a highly politicized battlefield. The values of the new guard millennials, Gen Z, and empowered women wealth holders are clashing directly with traditional shareholder primacy.
Which is fueling this massive anti-ESG backlash, and it's forcing corporations to distinguish between simple box checking and truly strategic, inimitable value creation that can actually stand up to legal scrutiny.
And finally, the family unit, which is supposed to be the bedrock of this whole vast transfer, is often fracturing under the emotional and legal weight of the assets. The money acts as a powerful solvent, confirming that worry that the hyper-individualistic defense of private claims can erode social cohesion. And it's all accelerated by legal frameworks that enable the control of private wealth for generations into the distant future.
So what's the final thought here?
I think the ultimate tension of the great wealth transfer isn't really about how much money changes hands. It's about whether the sheer size and the sought-after longevity of the private legacy will finally render the collective future unsustainable. The money is moving, but the true cost might be our enduring faith in a shared common world as individuals seek security and immortality, increasingly through the defensive, fortress-like structures of private property.